Peace. Yeah. So check in. I said, really just settle into doing these. Like I said, especially back 2017 when I started the Quiet Talks in the Community. Doing the trial run on my social media I was active on at the time. As I was saying then, as I realized now, like I said, bro, it's really been beneficial to me, And those who have provided feedback talking about, how beneficial it is and was to them. A combination of those two things, along with, again, that reality I was talking about, however long, things stand as they are, this has been part of my plans and, part of mission and career guided pathway, meso and macro level, interventions and work. So, it's one of the things I said I'm going to start doing is like scheduling like a standing hour to 90 minutes, maybe on a Saturday or Sunday, early evening. Call it Sit with Chris. Services and initiation, not initiation, that's interesting I said that, but services and initiatives tour, so introducing what I do and, who I am, building that meso and macro level therapeutic alliance, for the reasons that I state as I'm, marketing and introducing it. But yeah, like I said, this recent one, especially like I said, finally communicating from like all aspects of myself, and that's one of the things that I wanted to, talk about today is, how much support I've gotten from off-world family and allies, in this process, and how it's always been there, just been increasing, from my birth back in 1980 until now, you know what I'm saying? And, as it's evolved, especially after 26th of June 2010, it's really been fascinating. And like I said, just clearly quantum connection and communication, and like I said, just experiencing it all from everlasting to everlasting, highest heavens, scariest hells, and so all of the entities and essences and forms that exist within that continuum, Like I said, it's just pretty experienced with it now. That's what I'm getting to. So especially recently, like I said in I think one of the last videos, the theme of culmination. Like I said, it's just so rapid fire and clear and connecting. Like I said, when you merged into these unions and collectives, it's just part of the dynamic, the quantum connection and communication. So, very interesting thing was, set in front of me as, an inquiry, my continued development, and it's directly related to what I'm doing here, because it was like, yeah, bro, we noticed that like sometimes you will start a video or during a video act all kind of clueless and such, disorienting, reorienting kind of deal, like I don't know this, that, and the third, figuring out, especially like with technology or things within society, and especially the high 9D and 12D scientists was like, bro, it's like is that you actually being that, disconnected, discombobulated, acting like you don't know this, that, and the third? Or is that intentional? And, one of the metrics we've been taking, from the very beginning, calibrating as we've had to do, the higher world communication with this, 3D stuff and body and brain, you're usually when it happens immediately, rapidly, it's like, okay, we know it's a connection, it's there kind of deal. But the longest it takes, even if it's microseconds or to a few seconds before it's connected and registered, again, that distance, helps us to understand and calibrate, just what it takes, to have this kind of communication from, the 6, 9, 12D and beyond down to the 3D body and brain, like I said, questions of consciousness and neuropsych, and neurobiology. So this was one of the first times, because that's another thing I meant, I said I've been out in front of it, because, even at that level, connections happen so fast, there's no way it can physically possible. That's a long story, but, this was one of the first times where I had to okay, right, that is a great question. Let me sit with it and process it, and really answer it. And it took me back to, like I said, the 2nd/3rd grade when, they pulled me out of class and marched me upstairs, put me in the 3rd grade when I was a 2nd grader. And, it ultimately ended with, teacher praising me and the kids not liking me, and at least my perception of it, and me feeling bad and deciding that, it's not cool to be smart. So let me intentionally act like I'm dumb to go along and get along, to fit in. Like I said, that whole celebration of ignorance kind of deal. And as evidenced by, even outside mainstream stuff from the ghetto, the stereotype of the nerd kind of deal, the geek and all of that stuff, seeing people go through that and all of that, and, me trying to fit in, this, that, and the third, almost like a mission parameter. That was an outcome, so that's what I connected it to. But the final, and what I would say is a bigger piece, is that it's almost like, bro, it's a way to keep myself grounded, to keep myself connected to the limitations of being a biopod human, because it's like, if I'm not, and I'm fully how I'm functioning at that, again, 6-12D pace, it's like, bro, they locked the hell up. Psych ward and all that other stuff, or completely dismissed, you know what I'm saying, with the work I'm trying to do. Because like I said, people may not be able to perceive it, but just like everything else been going on, to be so precise and so in alignment with so much going on, it's like, and that would lead to me, again, biggest concern has always been not wanting to be here. You know what I'm saying? And just kind of flame it out, doing what I want to do, doing my own thing, So all of that stuff, one thing connects to the next, as we say. But naturally, again, whenever we have these inquiries and make these connections, like I said, things change. So I noticed since that moment yesterday morning, I've been a little bit more precise. You know what I'm saying? A little bit more dialed in, a little bit more tapped in, a little bit more direct. You know what I'm saying? And what that connects to, because another thing I said I was going to decide to do, in these next few talks, like I said, is pretty much like tell stories from my memoirs, spring 2011, when all of that happened between 2008 and 2010, that was the time I was, with my first wife, with such a powerful story, she played such a big part in it. Keeping me upright. That's what they said, during that time, focused on love. Like I said, that was probably the one thing that's always most powerful in my life, to combat the, dark parts of me and everything was going on. So when I wrote the memoirs, like I said, bro, that shit turned out to be like 33,000 words. You know what I'm saying? Just flowing, the way I do. And as I'm doing this, it reminded me of, an elder from my first year of high school when I just got in, trying to be a good student, in that environment. And one of the most important things, because it turned out to be so important for my path, is I think her name was Miss Allen, old granny, you know what I'm saying, teaching typing. And as I'm paying attention and all that other stuff, she had such a great way of teaching because she obviously taught it so long, taught that home row and all of that, and would put paper on top of our hands, to make sure, we would be able to type. So bringing that part up, because that's almost like how I can channel it, how I wrote my memoirs, every aspect of me, from the highest self to the, little ghetto boy, you know what I'm saying? All of it's coming out. So, but like I said, that personality in me and, the celebration of ignorance, kind of all of that, and ghetto parts of me, that was a smoke screen in a lot of ways, especially when word started to get around, because it was already up there with, Illuminatus in them and, leadership and families and empires of the earth. But, that was when, like I said, those empires and families started gathering, as the last ones are coming in now. So yeah, connecting all of this is like, as I tell these stories, you know what I'm saying, I'm going to give it the respect that I've always had at that highest, you know what I'm saying, and even when I'm being silly or doing the fool, as we would say, acting disoriented, this, that, and the third, like I don't get this, that, the third, I lose that when I'm standing in front of council, in courts and cathedrals, especially the crystal ones, so just did about 30 minutes ago. It's pretty awesome stuff. So yeah, and one of the stories, the first stories I want to tell from that is to that point, because like I said, bro, this is it, man. This is it, man. Like we seen happening around that time, 2005, 2006, 2007, before 2008, 2010 period hit, from a meso level in Black America, because, that's my area of research in cultural anthropology and cultural psych. It's like, we was closing ranks, bro, long before the whole BLM, and, that highest levels of BLM, just like everything. That's one of the reasons why, system trying to get out in front of this process, and continue to control the narrative and all of that, because as we've known and operated and planned for, as Black nationalists, is the separation, and you know what I'm saying, of our culture and community and how we want to live, a nation inside of a nation. And from, back in the day, all of the different variations of Black Wall Streets in Detroit, like Paradise Valley and Tulsa and pretty much everywhere. It had to be suppressed systemically, because otherwise we'd be a nation inside of a nation. And all you gotta do is look at all the other continents and, wars raging. That's really the reason why. So I won't go that deep into it, but just to say that that's always been a part of it, because there is a cosmic and quantum origin to all of that as well. And that's really one of the only ways, just like we see manifested on Earth. Like I said, the whole UN and one world governments and all that other stuff, even from both sides that are fighting, it's like, that's still a ecological template. The only way that worlds and constellations of worlds can live in ecological harmony is through this kind of bureaucracy and conferencing and concessions and all that other stuff. Wars happen that And the third, but like I said, as those spirits now transition and pass through, this is what it looks like. So, again, those are the names I can mention because, like I said, shouts out to all of these people who are, fully in alignment and being themselves, especially here on the YouTube, talking about this stuff and their travels and experiences and roles and responsibilities in this process, and just like I did with my memoirs, ready to offer my perspective, and this first story I'm going to tell is going to lead to the next one, and I'll, wrap up for now. But, I'll talk about this part first. Like I said, the whole Star Trek, Star Wars, all that other stuff, all of that stuff is, Dune and all of that, again, it's based on actual realities and, the two constellations and collectives that I first encountered, and participated in mending and unifying after, the awe happened was the well-known Galactic Federation of Light with the lesser-known, I first heard of it through that connection. It's called the Guardian Alliance of Free Worlds. And I won't get too deep into the trillions of light years of conflict that had happened, before I started participating. But yeah, just like, the first mending that happened, that one also was done rather swiftly and effectively, and again, it trickles down, and this is the trickling down. And like I said, the reason I mentioned specifically, because like I said, all these families, empires, and stuff of, in, on, and around ye earth connected to one or the other. You know what I'm saying? And just like the esoteric nature of things and trying to keep things hidden for numerous reasons, again, on both sides, friends of humanity and enemies of humanity, and the rest of those who are just indifferent to these creatures. That's pretty much the three sides, the trifurcation of, like we just talked about, the reason the bureaucracies and communications and concessions and understanding and cultural psych, cultural anthropology, just descended from more of quantum and cosmic anthropology and psychology. So, yeah, that's pretty much where all of this is and why, we're seeing so much and we'll continue to see much more about, different beings blinking in and out of these dimensions and different kind of crafts, manifesting here and there because, like I said, new agreements and new decrees. So all of that, as we've known, ultimately has to culminate with, the global leadership of the human, and like I said, slowly but surely, bro, like I said, very long and very specific plans that have been planned out, and just like we say in development of, treatment plans and individual plans of service and such for persons and families, it's like some of these items have to be actionable. If this happens, then that'll happen, but if that doesn't happen, then we got to do this kind of deal. So, and like I said, the best way to sum it up as to why there's still seemingly so much mystery and so much unknown, and especially those who are impatient or unknowing, oh man, why don't this or why don't that, and if they're this, they're that, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, bro, that's okay for you to say down here. it's a lot going on and a lot going into this because one thing always connects to the next. And that's where I'll wrap up with, just like I was talking about, the experiences kind of supported and solidified my faith growing up. It's like, as I was going through all this stuff, especially with my, first wife and all of the connections that brought us together and the role she played in everything, to the stuff here on the ground, like I said, gatherings happening and allies growing, but also adversaries growing at the same time, both in society, above and below ground, There's a very specific moments that made it clear, like, yeah, bro, this is really happening kind of deal. Like I said, even back my first fiance, it's like, bro, there was times where I was wishing it was mental and emotional illness, as it is by definition. And me just going to get treated and all of that would explain it away and I could just ignore it, but it was always deeper than that. And these consistent three-dimensional manifestations of it happening, especially when people had to subtly not blow their cover, but had to kind of give the wink, like, yeah, bro, we know, but hold on, because there's still a lot going on kind of deal. Like I said, the most impactful one that kind of really made me settle and start playing my role, even though I was frustrated by the pace because I'm always out in front of it. That's exactly what this ally said. And I won't say too much to reveal it, but let's just say it was a person very close to me since childhood. And again, there would have been no indication up to that point that this person should have been aware of all that was going on. But in that moment of crisis, where the walls was closing in and, protections in place and all levels of psychic and material, international and domestic attacks coming at me and us, had to kind of give a subtle wink. Like, the person literally leaned in, and it matter I'd never seen or heard this person communicate before or ever since. Like, Chris, what has to happen isn't ready to happen yet. So all this person said, and then the scene just went back, and I kind of paused for a minute, fully oriented, like, damn, bro, kind of like breaking character and all of that, but still a scene going on, and I had to play my part. So I kind of like, okay, and action again, like seeing behind that curtain, kind of adjustment bureau looking ass, which is fitting for me to even say with everything going on. But I was like, okay, that's fine, and it's back into it. And that led to, like I put in the title, culminating in me meeting and connecting with a woman with piercing yellow eyes. And I use woman in quotes because that was just the biopod she was occupying, when that scene culminated. So, yeah, man, like I said, just want to mention it here because, like I said, but one way or another, this is where we at. This is what's going on, with whole politicians and kingdoms and queendoms, not even realizing they done lost the plot and it been over, and, leadership has been transitioned a while ago. It's time for those reveals to happen, So, like I said, we'll see how it goes, and still standing on post, doing my part, but as they just told me, now and forever, the post is a throne.